Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all on this installment of Rosie Presents, one of Rosie the Riveter Trust's public education programs. Tonight, July 17th, marks the 79th anniversary of the Port Chicago disaster. And in commemoration of this historic event, we'll be showing the documentary Into Forgetfulness, which is only about 10 minutes, and then followed by a question and answer session with Kelli English, who currently serves as the Interpretation, Education, Outreach, and Division Manager for Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park, Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, Eugene O'Neill National Historical Site, and John Muir National Historical Site. Thank you so much for joining us on this important anniversary. I do want to say that we are recording this presentation for later viewing on our YouTube channel. And I invite you to place any questions you might have at any time in the chat box, please. And in order to preserve everybody's privacy, which is super important, as we know, only Kelli and I will be able to see the questions that you place in the chat. So now I'd like to get started with a brief introduction with Kelli English. So welcome, Kelli.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us tonight. This, as Lisa mentioned, this is a significant day. Today does mark 79 years since the explosion at Port Chicago Naval Magazine that killed 320 men, but had a significant impact on our nation and our nation's history. So thanks for joining us. It's a very somber day. It's not a day for celebration, but it is a day to consider what happened with that horrible disaster and how it impacted and can continue to impact our nation, yes, essentially. So this is one of the least known stories, I think, here in the Bay Area in terms of national park sites. This is one of the smallest and most difficult to access. So many people are unfamiliar with this story, even if they were alive when it occurred. So there's a lot of lack of knowledge out there. And so I'm thrilled that all of you decided to join us this evening. And so without further ado, Lisa, I think we can get a glimpse. This film does not go into all of the intricacies of the story. The story is very complex and very nuanced, but this film does do a great job at giving you a taste of the overall story. And so that's why we felt this format would work for introducing the story to many of you, some of you for the first time, and then providing an opportunity for reflection and questions, and for me to go into a little bit more detail about some aspects of the story.
Thanks, Kelli. So give me just a moment and we will begin the film. It is a smaller resolution, everybody, so it's not a glitch, but I just want to say that right now. So give me just a moment and we'll get it started.
In our lives, there are moments, events, usually lasting a very short time, that result in irreversible change. As a people, we have a need to memorialize these events so that future generations will know and remember. July 17th, 1944, at 10:17 p.m., a peaceful, quiet California summer night, thousands of miles from the fighting of World War II, an event took place. In one explosive moment, 320 men vanished, and in the rubble, the way the military and America treated its citizens began to change.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately
Most of the black sailors stationed at Port Chicago had enlisted hoping to fight the enemy. Unable to serve on the front lines, they found themselves doing dangerous manual labor. Munitions manufactured around the country would arrive at Port Chicago daily by train. As a transit site, not a storage site, the cargo had to be unloaded as rapidly as possible. It was the job of the black enlisted sailors to manually transfer the munitions from the rail cars to large cargo ships. With war raging in the Pacific, victory depended on rapid delivery of munitions, and the sailors of Port Chicago were proud of their crucial link in the delivery process. Ignoring standard safety practices, 2 ships were loaded at one pier. The work proceeded 24 hours a day. All the sailors handling cargo were black. All the officers in charge were white. Competition was encouraged by the officers. Loading rates for each division were posted, and incentives were awarded. Slower divisions were shamed and threatened. Officers and sailors cut corners to save time. Many people warned the fast pace of the work, the huge volume of munitions being moved, loading 2 ships on one pier, and the lack of proper training, proper safety procedures would lead to disaster. Two explosions, 6 seconds apart, ignited the night sky with a column of fire and steel rising 2 miles. The first blast was fairly small. The second incinerated 2 ships, the pier, 16 rail cars, 320 men. The survivors were in shock. Friends had disappeared without a trace. Next time, it would be them. On August 9th, 300 black sailors were ordered back to work loading munitions. Continued lack of training, unsafe working conditions, lack of any official explanation, everyone believed another explosion would happen. The benefits of Navy life no longer outweighed the extreme danger of the work. Any order but that. Any order but that. After a peaceful confrontation, over 250 black sailors were arrested. The sailors were given the opportunity to put the so-called uprising behind them and return to work. About 200 reluctantly agreed, but were instead thrown in the brig. The 50 remaining black enlisted sailors who refused to load munitions were charged with mutiny. in time of war, punishable by death. On October 24, 1944, the specially convened military court found all 50 men guilty of mutiny as charged. All were sentenced 8 to 15 years in prison and dishonorable discharge from the Navy. Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial was established to honor the courage and commitment of the sailors, Marines, National Guardsmen, Merchant Marines, and civilians killed and injured in the largest homeland disaster during World War II. The memorial recognizes the critical role they and the survivors of the explosion played in the winning of the war in the Pacific. The explosion and its aftermath was a major catalyst that helped persuade the U.S. military to begin the long journey to racial justice and equality. Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial will ensure the story of these brave men is not lost into forgetfulness.
Hello, everyone. I'm sure that you all have lots of questions about that. I would say in about 4 hours or less than 4 hours is the official anniversary, 79 years ago. And I do want to say that this film is available to watch on the NPS website. You can search for it quite easily. But that film in 10 minutes could barely tell the story. And so that's why I'm so grateful that Kelli is here. And so for now, I am going to turn it over to Kelli English.
All right, let's see here. First of all, I want to announce that I did put the official website for the park in the chat, www.nps.gov/POCH. And that will take you to our website where you can indeed find this film if you'd like to share it with other folks. I do have a presentation I could show. I'm a little afraid to show it because it may take up a good amount of the time, but I might try walking through it very quickly so as to try to flesh out a little bit more of the details of the story. But first, I do want to address a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. There's actually three different folks who have asked the same question, or similar question. The first one is, are any of the survivors still living? And the best answer I have is, to our knowledge, the last military survivor of the explosion passed away, I think it was 2022. I think it was just about a year ago that the last known survivor that we know of passed away. He had been about 17 years old at the time. My impression is that most of the other folks who lived through the blast were children in the town of Port Chicago at the time. And so there are still some of them that are still alive today. But as far as any sailors who survived, I believe that Ray Ross, who passed away in 2022, was the last one that we know of. I say that we know of because there may be others out there that we have not been in touch with that may still have survived. The other questions have to do with the convictions of the Port Chicago 50, there having been convicted of mutiny, and whether or not those sentences were ever commuted and what the resolution is. Currently, those convictions still stand today. One thing I will mention a little bit later on is there are quite a few grassroots efforts underway to work towards the exoneration of the 50. I believe the hope is that perhaps that can be addressed in time for the 80th anniversary next year. But right now, those sentences do still stand, and the prevailing opinion is that the only entity that can exonerate the men is the U.S. Navy itself. And so there are some advocacy out there happening right now on their behalf. The other question had to do with whether or not imprisoned sailors were freed early. Yes, kind of. Essentially what happened was that I'm assuming that this person is talking about the sentences for mutiny that were 8 to 15 years. The war ended not too long after this. And once the war had ended, it was thought that such long sentences could no longer be justified now that the war was over. And so most of them were commuted. Depending on the individual, most of them only served between 1 and 3 years. And really, most of them, it was between 1 and 2. There were a few individuals that did serve longer than 2. So 1 to 3 covers the gamut for all of them. However, everyone who was involved with that received a less than honorable discharge. The 50 as well as the 208 who went back to work after the 3 days. So that those records followed them their entire lives. Someone is asking another question about the fact that some of our congressional representation in the Bay Area has been working on exoneration for many years. That is true. For quite a few years, Congressman Desaulnier and Congressman Barbara Lee have both had resolutions in Congress trying to do that. The last one that made it into a bill that was signed into law ordered the U.S. Navy to exonerate the men, but the U.S. Navy essentially sort of sat on it and didn't take any steps forward towards that end. We do have reason to believe there was a recent exoneration of the Philadelphia 15. I will admit I've not read up on the details of that case, but apparently that just came down about 3 or 4 weeks ago or so, that there were 15 sailors that were exonerated, African-American sailors too. I don't know enough about the details to know how similar the situations are, but I can tell you that some of the advocacy groups are looking very closely at that case and looking at as another reason to help the Navy see through a way to exonerating the Port Chicago 50. So. All right, I think I have addressed all the current questions in the chat. So I will see if I can attempt to share my screen. And Lisa, if some questions pop up while I am very quickly showing a few photos, please do go ahead and alert me, since I won't be able to see that.
I will. And I think what would be best is if you give the presentation that you want and take the time that you want, Kelly. And then as you wrap up, I'll feed them to you. How about that?
That works. Let me make sure that I'm sharing. So it looks like it actually didn't start from the beginning, but let me see if I can go back to the beginning. Bear with me just a second here. Let me see if I can end it and click on the right side this time. All right. So for those of you who've not been there, which is probably most of you, this is Port Chicago Naval Magazine. There are days out there that are spectacular, where you just look out and you don't realize the weight of history that rests out there. The memorial itself was actually established by the Navy in 1994 on the 50th anniversary of the explosion, and became an official National Park Service site, a standalone National Park Service site in 2009. It was an affiliated site for quite some time before that, but then it ended up being the very first National Park Service site that President Obama signed into law after he took office. And so let's see here. Backing up a little bit, I know that the film gave you a little bit of a sense of the beginnings of this story, but what I will say is that even prior to the events of Pearl Harbor, the US Navy was already looking for a good West Coast location for a deep water munitions port. And the attack at Pearl Harbor sped up some of those plans. And Port Chicago Naval Magazine opened in 1942. If you take a look at this photo here, this is an aerial photo from before the explosion. You can see here that on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see, oh, I have a pointer tool, don't I? Let me see if I can do that. You can see here how the pier was constructed so that you could have two ships loaded at the same time, which again was against safety standards. But one of the themes here is that the Navy prioritized speed of loading and the speed that they could send munitions out to the Pacific Theater over safety protocols, even the existing safety protocols at the time, of which there were not very many. This was a very significant port. It was located here for a few different reasons, one of which had to do with the deep water in Suisun Bay. They needed deep water to be able to get heavy ships like that in and out. It was located close, but not too close to major population centers. And it also was very well connected in terms of rail car lines. This was very important. In fact, there were rail lines that came right out onto the pier, and those railroad cars were essential for not only transporting munitions from across the country to Port Chicago Naval Magazine, but then for also unloading them into the various magazines that are in these revetments that you can see scattered on the landscape. And then when a ship came in, then loading those rail cars up again and bringing those munitions right out onto the pier and then loading those ships. So this location had all the right combination of things. The closest town was the town of Port Chicago, which, as you can see, is in this photo. It's right up here. It's actually not that far from the pier itself. And then, of course, you had the major population centers of Oakland and Berkeley that were relatively close by as well. So all in all, it was very well situated. And in the wake of Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of there was so much recruitment and so much signing up. Young men across the country were signing up to fight in World War II, and for African American communities, especially, it took on a special meaning. There was a whole campaign started by the Pittsburgh Courier called the WWII campaign, and that meant really trying to fight the war against fascism abroad, but also fighting against racism at home, because this was still a segregated military. Although African Americans and other ethnicities had been in the American military since the Revolutionary War, since the end of the Civil War, the military had been segregated by race, with entire Black units or colored troops, many of which gained fame more recently as the Buffalo Soldiers. And they were segregated. In the Army, they did a lot of the same jobs that other troops did, but there certainly was a lack of promotion for promising young African-American men could not be promoted to officer very easily. There were only a handful of Black officers during this time period. And in the Navy in particular, being Black limited what opportunities you had in the Navy. There was a reluctance to have Black sailors on ships and living on board ships together with white sailors in the Navy. I say in the Navy because the Army was a very different thing. There were many colored units they were called colored units at the time, in the Army in World War I, who went overseas to France and helped fight in those conflicts. But the Navy was particularly insistent about maintaining segregation, even as you had Black men being trained on Tuskegee Airfield in the Army Air Corps as pilots. During the same time frame, you had Black men being limited to the jobs of messmen or stevedore or other service industries within the military. And there's some amazing documentation of just how deep-seated this racism was. You can see here in this excerpt from the Secretary of the Navy, and between the Secretary of the Navy and Senator Arthur Capper, that there was, and there's more to this letter. There were whole discussions going on about how it would be unfair to ask Southern white boys to share living quarters with Negro sailors. And so there's all kinds of documentation like this that really makes you understand and appreciate just how deep-seated this was within American society at the time, and certainly within the military at the time. Now, the heroism of Dory Miller in the attack on Pearl Harbor was incredibly inspiring for many African Americans. He was a messman. He was not trained for battle, but he carried wounded soldiers and took over a machine gun. He was presented with the Navy Cross. He ended up passing away. He died on a ship that was sunk during the war, and he's recently had an aircraft carrier named after him, and he is the only African American with this honor. His image was used on a recruiting poster during the war, and a lot of African Americans signed up for the Navy because of Dory Miller's example. Many of them were taken to Great Lakes Training Center, trained as, they were segregated there. There were separate bunks, there were separate mess halls, separate blood supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And they did not have opportunities that the white sailors had. Many of them did become stevedores and were transferred out to Port Chicago Naval Magazine to do the very dirty and very dangerous job of loading munitions. They received little or no training in this. At the time, this was long before safety was a priority for the military. And again, speed was emphasized above all else. They were given very little training on how to handle things at all, much less appropriately. They were told that there were no detonators, that the munitions were not live, that they were not sensitive, et cetera, et cetera. And it was pretty egregious. Granted, this was the largest munition shipping facility on the West Coast during the war. Almost every shipment of munitions that went to the Pacific Theater went through Port Chicago. It was a crucial port that was incredibly vital for military success overseas in the Pacific Theater. Now, we know a lot about what the experience was like because of some of the oral histories from some of these survivors of the explosion. And if my screen is working properly, you may have to turn your volume up a bit because the sound is very low in some places here, but I'm going to try to play a short excerpt for you demonstrating the some of the recollections in their own words from some of the survivors of the explosion. So this is a visual of our, let me change my pointer here. This is a visual of one of the existing remaining magazines and the inside of a boxcar that we have out at the site. And it gives you a sense of, you'll see the visual as you listen to the stories of these men. Let's see if this works. Uh-oh, hang on, I'm having some trouble playing it. Oh, I have to do it here.
Here in the magazine area, safety precautions were rigidly followed at all times.
Oh, man, I tell you. I don't know, it made you kind of nervous. You always was uneasy about handling all that ammunition, bombs, torpedoes, whatever.
We sent everything out of this, from 30-30 rifle cartridges all the way up to 2,000-pound blockbusters, we call them.
The first time I saw any ammunition was when we were called out of the barracks and lined up and marched to the dock. Our specific jobs were explained, and we took it from there as best we could.
My job basically was to load ammunition with the crew which worked in the hold of the ship.
You be down in the hole. Here come them big bombs and things coming down the rampway they had built. But sometimes they let it come down too fast. And they hit together and they made a loud noise.
You hear this all night long. Boom, 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 boom.
And that would almost give you a heart attack. Yeah, you would almost have a heart attack. And so we used to ask them sometime and say, is it any danger this ammunition explode? They say, oh, no, don't worry about it. Say, it's not live. Say, don't have no detonators in them.
We were told that it wasn't dangerous. We had no knowledge whatsoever of ammunition. And we just took the words of those that said it wasn't dangerous.
We was not trained to load ammunition. We would take ammunition, we'd take a crowbar. When we had to go so high, we'd take that crowbar and push that ammunition up there because they told us it would not explode because it didn't have no detonator in it.
All right. I wanted to take the time to do that because I think it's important that we are able to hear those voices explaining things in their own words. Those are the voices of Percy Robinson, Albert Williams, DeWitt Jameson, Joseph Small, and Robert Routh, who all worked at Port Chicago during World War II. I should also mention that all 5 of those gentlemen have passed away.
Here in the magazine area.
There we go. I seem to have, there we go, okay. Forgive the technical mishaps here. So as you heard from the film, the night of July 17th, 1944, an incredible amount of tonnage exploded. The E.A. Bryant, as you heard, was almost completely loaded with munitions. The Quinault Victory was empty, but being prepped for loading, which was to start at midnight. It was gassed up, I believe, so there was a lot of fuel on board. The picture that you see here is of, we believe, the what was left of the Quinault Victory when it had been blasted into the air. We do still have some pieces of ship that have been found. Our theory is that most of those are from the Quinault Victory because the E.A. Bryant had so much tonnage of munitions, the equivalent of, 4,600 tons of TNT and 5,000 equivalent tons TNT exploded. Because of the rail cars that were on the pier that weren't on the ships, but were on the pier in the vicinity. And so our theory is that not much was left of the E.A. Bryant, that it was almost vaporized, and that most of the ships, pieces of ships recovered later, probably from the Quinault Victory, though there's no way to know for sure. It was an incredible disaster. 320 men died instantly. 390 military personnel and civilians were wounded. Incredibly, no one in the nearby town of Port Chicago lost their lives, but so much damage everywhere, to the pier, to the town. It was absolutely incredible. The dock was destroyed pretty much down to the pilings, more or less. It's difficult to really appreciate the scope of this, even from the pictures that do demonstrate it very graphically. In this next slide you see here, and I don't know if my laser pointer is working, but I'll try it again. Here you can see this inner circle here represents the debris field. So all the way as far south as Walnut Creek and up into Vallejo, you had debris falling from the sky. There was a Coast Guard pilot, I believe, who was in the air at the time of the explosion and reported seeing burning metal as big as a house that was passing him 10,000 feet up in the air. The outer rim here, the outer circle, is the insurance claim zone where windows were shattered in buildings as far away as San Francisco through this blast. There's a funky little cutout here on this side of it. That's because this is Mount Diablo. And so it's, there are very few insurance claims right there. And so otherwise, this would be more of a circle, roughly. But as you can see, it reverberated throughout the entire East Bay. And folks who remember it say that their immediate assumption was that they were under attack, that Japan had attacked the mainland this time. And then they quickly were able to ascertain that it was not, in fact, an attack, but a horrible, horrible accident at the Naval Magazine. Let me see if I can turn my laser pointer off so I can advance the slide. Yeah, I mean, you see the level of all the windows are blown out pretty much on the base itself. You saw the photo in the film of the rail car crushed like a matchbox car. It was really quite something. And I should mention too that in the aftermath of the explosion, the surviving sailors immediately jumped into action and tried to assist. They did a lot of cleanup, which involved picking up body parts as well. Many of them, some were injured, but they dove in and helped as best they could. The Navy was frantic to try to resume munitions operations. This was a huge, huge interruption in the supply chain to the Pacific, and they really wanted to try to get things going again. I should mention too that this is where some of the disparate treatment came into play at all levels. And what I mean by that is that white officers who survived were given 30 days survivor's leave, where they were given time off to recover from this traumatic experience. And they were often then reassigned to other duty in the Navy, even other locations. The Black sailors, however, did not receive any type of leave. They stayed and dove right in and helped clean up and helped start to the recovery process. In addition, some of this disparate treatment even went as far as the halls of Congress. Congress proposed paying some compensation to the families of the deceased. And the original proposal was $5,000. I would need to use Google to tell you exactly how much that was worth in today's dollars back in 1944, but the proposition was $5,000. However, Congressman Rankin from Mississippi was totally fine with it until he realized just how many of the families receiving this would be Black families. And he was very explicit about this. He did not think that so many Black families, again, 202 sailors out of the 320 were African-American, almost 2/3 of the casualties. He felt so strongly about this that he lobbied for the benefit to be reduced to $2,000 instead of $5,000. And in the end, Congress settled on $3,000, which was 3/5 of the original proposed payment. This did apply to all of the families, not just the Black families, which I can imagine that the white families did not like this very much, but that was what Congress passed. But the fact that, that being Black can be used and treated as a justifiable reason for reducing compensation upon the loss of a loved one on duty in the course of duty is quite staggering and difficult to imagine that would happen today, but it did in fact happen in 1944. So obviously the base was unusable and would be for some time. Most of the sailors ended up being transferred across to Mare Island in Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, which suddenly, soon became kind of a main focus of trying to work on resuming operations. But as you can imagine, the men were traumatized, both from the experience of the disaster itself. Many of them were nervous and jumping at every little noise. No one knew what had caused the explosion, and that created an extreme amount of anxiety. The aftermath of picking up body parts would be traumatic for anyone. But again, this was before the days of acknowledged PTSD. But certainly this was all spinning, and the men could tell that they were, that the operations were gearing up to try to resume loading, and they were afraid. They were afraid that there was going to be another explosion. They didn't understand why no protocols had been changed in the wake of the disaster. And so just 3 weeks later, on August 9th, 1944, 4 companies of men were marched together, and the order was given to march down to the docks, essentially to begin loading. And the entire company of men stopped short and refused to load munitions. And you heard some of the details of that. There were 258 who initially refused. After 3 days, 208 of them relented and then were coerced essentially into resuming loading. 50 of them continued to refuse and were charged in the largest mass mutiny trial in U.S. naval history. And during the trial was when Thurgood Marshall was sent by the NAACP to assist the defense, but it really wasn't much of and there were lots of problems with the prosecution. It was pretty much a foregone conclusion. The Navy was determined to make an example of these men, and despite the efforts of the defense military lawyer and of Thurgood Marshall, who spoke personally with many of the men, that took the jury only 90 minutes to convict 50 men of mutiny, and it only took that long because they took a lunch break in the middle of the 90 minutes. It was a foregone conclusion. In addition, the the board of inquiry that was convened to investigate the cause of the explosion essentially blamed the explosion on the black sailors who had died. They concluded that they had made some error that resulted in the explosion. And you can see from these quotes that were part of the official inquiry that, again, this is exactly how deep seated the racism was, that the consensus was that the colored enlisted personnel were neither temperamentally nor intellectually capable of handling high explosives. Now, lest anyone should think that I'm being too hard on the Navy, it should be mentioned that there were several outside observers who tried to warn the Navy that their practices were unsafe. Some of the stevedore organizations out of the Port of Oakland observed and raised concerns. The Coast Guard came and observed and raised concerns, and the Navy essentially ignored all of it. There were plenty of warnings that the pace that was being maintained was not safe or sustainable, and the Navy prioritized speed overall and ignored it. And I think it's actually an interesting question of, would the Navy have placed a higher priority on safety if white sailors were primarily the ones who were on the front lines? I think it's a question we'll never know the answer to, and it haunts us, as it should. I also am often asked if the sailors would have been charged with mutiny if they were white. And I think it is fairly safe to say that if the sailors involved with this entire disaster had been white, I do not think that the disparate treatment after the explosion would have occurred. I do not think that things would have gotten as far. The work stoppage, where men refused to load munitions, may not have happened at all because of the disparate treatment not having happened, and not having traumatized men try to go back to the same job. And I think it's possible that the mutiny trial, even if it had gotten that far, I'm not sure that they would have tried all the sailors with mutiny. I think that things might have been very different indeed if the sailors had not been African American. It is very difficult to separate the racism from the events that occurred, because all of the events were tainted, as you can see here from these quotes, by the inherent racism involved. Thurgood Marshall was explicit about saying that this really should be the Navy on trial for its policy towards African Americans, which again was more extreme than any of the other military branches in terms of having only African American sailors do the dirtiest, dangerous jobs, and having them be limited to those types of jobs. Marshall did an amazing job, though, bringing media attention and scrutiny to not only the trial, but also to the appeal. And he filed an appeal to the decision, although it still stood. But his pamphlet over here on the left-hand side that he used in the appeal caught the attention of the White House. And the public outcry was such that the Navy was forced to change its practices. They were forced to, because now a bright light had been shown on exactly what was going on, and they were forced to make changes. They could no longer have only Black sailors doing the most dangerous jobs. They had to offer other opportunities to Black enlisted sailors. And in 1948, President Truman issued the executive order, Executive Order 9981, that essentially forced the desegregation of the entire armed forces, which was an enormous step forward in civil rights in our country. And it also laid bare the question of, if a large traditional institution like the military, and remember that letter, a lot of folks were convinced that the Navy could not possibly have enlisted Black sailors on ships, et cetera, et cetera. If a large institution like the military could desegregate, then why couldn't other American institutions also desegregate? And so this laid the groundwork for Brown versus Board of Education with desegregation in schools. It galvanized the civil rights movement, and eventually racial discrimination and segregation were declared unconstitutional throughout many aspects of American life. But this event here, the explosion, the aftermath with the mutiny trial, it really served as a catalyst for desegregating the Navy. I do think that the entire armed forces, excuse me. I do think that the military was already on that path to desegregation, but it would have come much slower had it not been for this event. Now, one thing I should mention for those of you who want to learn more, Robert Allen's book is the seminal source on this, the Port Chicago Mutiny. He, as I mentioned, did oral history interviews with many survivors of the explosion, and including some of the 50 who were still alive back in the 80s, and then wrote this book about that experience in the trial based on their story. And it was this book that inspired former Congressman George Miller and his chief of staff John Lawrence to really start working on legislation to try to establish a memorial, which at the time was first established through the Navy, and then became a site affiliated with National Park Service. And again, that site was dedicated on the 50th anniversary of the explosion. And so the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial was also formed around that time, and they began advocating for it to be created as a national park site, which eventually it was in 2009. And the Friends have also been advocating for exoneration for many, many years. And if you go to their website, you can find some links for how to learn more. There's also a new organization that's been formed called the Port Chicago 50 that are also really working hard. It's actually a task force of the Contra Costa County Bar Association, with a lot of lawyers who think that there are several really good legal arguments for why exoneration is the only acceptable outcome. And so there's a lot of folks, this is not something that the Park Service can do itself as a government agency, but we are very open about our sense that this is a grave injustice that needs to be rectified. So we don't do the advocating, but we are very much in touch with those who are. So I encourage all of you to try to come visit the memorial. It is very difficult to visit because it is currently located on Military Ocean Terminal Concord. After the Concord weapon, I should back up in my story a little bit and mention that in the aftermath of the explosion, the Navy decided it needed to expand. It needed to expand the base, needed to expand and increase the munitions storage capacity. And the town of Port Chicago was just too close if something were to happen because of all the damage and injuries that happened the first time with the disaster. And so it took about 20 years and there was a lot of opposition from the town. But finally in 1968, the Navy used eminent domain and took possession of the town, bought out all the landowners, probably for less than market rate, and essentially raised the town. And that was part of the base's expansion from Port Chicago Naval Magazine into the Concord Naval Weapons Station. When the Concord Naval Weapons Station was disbanded in the 90s, that was when the Navy kind of moved out, so to speak. It was giving up a lot of the inland portion of the base, but then the Army's Transportation Battalion Division took over the tidal portion because that deep water port is still incredibly valuable for moving munitions and loading them onto gigantic military ships. And they are still doing that today at the base. The technology is a lot different than it was back in World War II. But for that reason, the site is located on an active military base that is much more secure than most bases are. Any visitors have to undergo a low-level background check before they can visit the site. And for much of the year, access is prohibited because there's an active loading operation going on. So this is not a national park site you can just walk up to and walk on at your own leisure. You have to reach out to us and try to make a reservation. We do run tours whenever we do have an open period where the Army is not running operations and can allow us to provide access to the public. And so you see these granite pillars here. We have some waysides that help tell the story, and we have all of the names of all of the 320 men that were killed in the various divisions. There were some civilian contractors who were among the dead, and they're all listed on these plaques at the site. We also have several remetments that are part of the site, and in that boxcar that you saw in the video, to get a sense of what life was like for the men there, and that with that experience of loading munitions day in and day out, 24 hours a day. The story is not totally complete without mentioning that in the 90s, when the 50th anniversary came around, when there was some energy around trying to establish a national memorial and get it affiliated with the Park Service, There were only 3 of the Port Chicago 50 who were still alive at the time, and they were offered, or the question was posed to them if they wanted to pursue a presidential pardon. 2 of them chose not to because they reasoned that pursuing a pardon would be admitting that they had done something wrong, and they did not feel that they had done anything wrong. And so they did not want to pursue a pardon. However, Freddie Meeks agreed with that logic, but also felt that the media attention that would come as a result of him getting the pardon was worth pursuing the pardon because he wanted the story to be told. Here's a quote from him. "After all these years, the world should know what happened at Port Chicago. It should be cleared up that we did not commit mutiny, and we were charged with that because of our race." It's a quote from him. And he was granted a pardon on December 23rd, and he passed away just a couple of years after that. It's a very moving site. It's a very peaceful site. Whenever I'm there, I feel a sense of dignity and pride in that the men felt a lot of pride and patriotism of what they were doing. They really wanted to serve their country and to fight in that war. And they endured an incredible amount of indignities in pursuit of that. And those who lost their lives did so honorably in the course of fulfilling their duty. And we continue to honor them. Many of the dead are actually buried in Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno. There are many graves of unknown U.S. sailors, and there's a whole cluster of them in what used to be the colored section of the cemetery, because back in the 40s, federal cemeteries were segregated. Even in death, segregation had to be maintained. And so many of them are kind of clustered together in a section, but all of those sections have been kind of filled in now because of all the conflicts. And so they are scattered around there. We're actually at Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. We're working on creating a handout with the location of all of the associated headstones that are at that cemetery. So the visitors who come and want to go down there on their own and pay tribute to each of those graves will have a resource soon to be able to do so. So we have many oral histories. We have a few objects. We have memories, interviews that have been conducted with the Port Chicago sailors and their families. We actually, Dr. Robert Allen gave us all of his research when he retired. And so we have his oral histories, both transcripts and recordings, as you heard. So we have a lot of that. And this history is not that ancient. There are families all the time that are just discovering that they have a connection to the story because of an uncle who died in World War II that they didn't understand what the circumstances were, that, that uncle was often, we've had a few folks discover recently that their parents or their uncle was one of the victims in this disaster. So this history is not that old, and there's still a lot that we can discover. And it's certainly very relevant for those families of those who lost their lives. At the commemoration ceremony on Saturday, we presented the flag that flies at the site to a gentleman whose father was killed when he himself was 1 year old, and it meant a lot to him. He was in tears when we presented the flag to him to honor his father. And so with that, I need to figure out how to end this slideshow so that we have time for a few questions. And this is an amazing story that needs to be told, and it cannot be told enough because it's incredible to realize that this all transpired this way. But by the same token, that's where this country was 79 years ago. And there are important lessons here and continued injustice that needs to be addressed. And above all, it's a story that makes this site nationally significant. And it's a story that we owe it to the 320, as well as to all the survivors who are with us, to be able to tell properly and to tell it as often as we can. I have too many screens going at once.
Fantastic. That's okay. Thank you so much. Even though we're coming up on the 7 o'clock hour, I just want to extend this a little bit because this history is so important, so unknown, and so rich. And I'm just curious myself, were any of the white officers reprimanded?
Not that I'm aware of. Essentially, most of their actions were more or less excused. I am looking really very quickly through the chat. I don't know if you've addressed any of these questions in the chat at all, Lisa. I couldn't see the chat at all.
Well, I was going to feed them to you so that you didn't have to run through them.
Let's see here. Where is the memorial located? It is located in Concord, on Military Ocean Terminal Concord. But again, you have to make reservations with Park Service if you would like to try to visit. This story absolutely needs to reach a broader audience. The only film I think, well, that's not true. there was actually like a made for TV series years ago that was done. That's actually pretty good. There are, I think, a lot of folks who are interested in trying to create film miniseries, et cetera, et cetera. I totally agree. The story needs to reach a broader audience, and it's our hope that with some of our impending future partnerships that we can work towards that. I should mention too that some of the land of the former Concord Naval Weapons Station was transferred to East Bay Regional Park District. This was actually built into our legislation that they could receive this land and partner with the National Park Service. The idea is that there'll never be able to be a visitor center at the memorial itself, but that there will be a joint visitor center between the Park Service and East Bay Regional Park District on former Concord Naval Weapons Station land that will be a home for the story, that folks can come and really explore the story even during those times when Matco is closed to the public. So that is exciting. And I think as a result of some of the planning for that, there will be a number of additional resources that are going to be created and come out of that.
I do know that I think Morgan Freeman was a producer of
on the TV
a film like 20 something years ago called Mutiny, and that is available to rent somewhere. I don't know. But I have watched it. So, and I agree that this history needs to be told and retold and retold, like many of the Homefront stories. This is just an extension of what was going on here on the US Homefront, and was very markedly important to where we are today. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Couple of things. I did answer one question in the chat here. Yes, several of the survivors that you heard were from the Port Chicago 50. Not all, I don't think, but at least 3. Looking here. Lisa put the dollars here. $5,000 in 1944, purchasing power of $86,000 today, which obviously is nothing compared to the value of someone's life. And yes, the sailors were very young. There weren't that many 17-year-olds. Ray Ross was a little unique, but I've heard some really crazy stories of 16, 17-year-olds signing up during World War II. So I believe it. There was a lot of desire to prove oneself and to fight against fascism at the time. But yes, most of them, I would say, were between 18 to 24 years old. So these are college age kids, folks who would have enlisted right out of high school. It's really, they were young men in this impossible situation. What happened to the town of Port Chicago is another question. Essentially, the Navy decided that they were going to use eminent domain to take over the town, and the residents there fought it for about 20 years, which is how we have there's a whole group of folks who grew up, kids who grew up in the town, especially between the disaster and in 1968, when the town was taken over formally by the federal government. So it didn't dissolve right afterwards. The town fought it because they didn't want to have to leave, but the Navy was determined to both provide more of a buffer between their operations and civilian communities, but also to provide more storage for munitions. And so they took it over and kicked everybody out. The congressional compensation bill, I'm guessing that you mean the one where it was reduced from $5,000 to $3,000. I don't know for sure, but I suspect it was the same Congress session that the disaster occurred in. It was either that one or the one right after that. So it would have been 1944 or 1945. Yes, Thurgood Marshall tried his best, but as you can saw, that's why I love showing some of those quotes, because it's one thing for me to state that this was happening and that this was what society was like. But when you see the documentation on the written record of these things, it is quite stark. And it's very obvious that the racism was systemic and it was structural, and it was baked into every aspect of society for the most part at the time. And that's why the civil rights movement was so vital for really breaking through some of that. How folks can visit. Sadly, you need to go to our website and see when we have open periods where Matco is not having operations, and then we do try to set up tours. Please go ahead and send us an inquiry through the website. We do keep a running list of folks who would like to visit, and we try to get folks out there as soon as we can. We had a long closure period this spring, and when we had like one weekend where we had it open, a couple of us rallied and we did like 2 tours on a Thursday and a Friday to try to get more people through. Every now and then the things change at the base, and we actually had to cancel some tours in June, unfortunately. So it's a little tricky to access the site, but we do the best we can to try to get folks out there who are interested. It is worth visiting in person. There's a lot of power there to be in the place where it happened and to be able to pay respects to those who lost their lives there.
I agree with you as somebody who's been there 3 times now. It's both beautiful and poignant and sad and all the things. It's hard to
Absolutely.
describe because it's so quiet, because it is on a military installation and only a few people can go at a time. It really is a cause for self-reflection and reflection about where we are in this country today. So,
There's
um,
one more question that I didn't get to address in the chat. It wasn't really a question, it was a statement that Port Chicago, and really the Concord Naval Weapons Station in general, because it was known as that after about 1968, was the site of many anti-nuclear protests in the 80s and 90s, including a very famous one with involving a rail car and a protester who threw themselves in front of the rail car. So yes, there's quite a long history there. That's one of the benefits of our partnership with East Bay Regional Park District, because that history of that land is a little bit out of the Park Service's scope. It's not why the site is a national park site, but through the partnership with them, they are also now telling the broader stories of the town of Port Chicago, of the Concord Naval Weapons Station. And so we're partnering together as agencies to really tell the history, the military history of that land, and going back further to before the military was there. And it's a partnership. We don't envision a visitor center for probably another 7 to 10 years, but you have to start somewhere. Visitor centers don't build themselves overnight. And so we are looking forward to really being able to tell the fuller story in that way. Whew, 7:05.
oh, look at you. You just scrolled right through them. I can't thank you enough for doing this for us. And I just want to remind everybody, this is being recorded. It will be on Rosie the Riveter Trust YouTube channel. Give it a few days, but it will be there. And again, this is Rosie Presents. I'm Lisa Foote. I work with the public education projects as well as special projects with Rosie the Riveter Trust. And as a reminder, our priorities are the park's priorities. And as a service to you all, to the general public, and in support of our national park, this is given to you as just a public education benefit. But if you do want to support us, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can go to our website, but I'm also going to put our link to support us in the chat. Again, everything that you donate is 100% tax deductible, and it allows us to create these kinds of programs again on the 79th anniversary of the Port Chicago disaster. Can't thank Kelli enough. And I also want to remind you, one of the biggest parties of the year is coming up on September 23rd. It's our annual gala. If you've been there, you already know what a great time it is. So I encourage you to please join us. The funds that we raise there help support the parks programs such as Every Kid Outdoors, installations and special exhibits at the National Park, as well as Rosie Service Corps and this program. So make sure to tell your friends about this. This will be on YouTube, like I said, and you can always go to our website at rosietheriveter.org. So that's it. Thank you so much, Kelli. And think about it, in about 3 hours is the exact timing, right? 3 hours.
10:18. 10:18 p.m.
Yep. So we'll see you next time. Hopefully we'll see you in August or September, and definitely at our gala. So good night, everybody.
Good night.